So Tim, tell me how Clonakilla Wines got started.
Well, Clonakilla was started by my dad, Dr. John Kirk. He's the founder, 50 years ago this year, actually, Karl.
Well, 50 years is working well, because that's fabulous.
Well, thank you so much. This is not just any Clonakilla, this is the top of the tree. This is our Shiraz Viognier. So this is the one that we're internationally famous for.
So why did your dad start it 50 years ago?
Well, Dad had an interest in wine, which goes back to his childhood, actually. His parents owned a couple of hotels in Ireland, and he was at boarding school as a kid in England, but he'd come home in the school holidays. And when he was a teenager, say 14, 15 years of age, he would be back to Ireland, back to the hotel, and to keep him out of mischief, I imagine, his parents would put him to work, and his job was to serve behind the bar and also to look after the drinks needs for the customers dining in the hotel restaurant. So, and as part of that job, he also had to deal with the travelling wine salesman who'd be coming through with, trying to sell him this wine and that. He had to make some decisions about which wines to buy for his family business. And so, not to look a fool, he thought he'd better find out something about it. So he started, even before he had any concept or taste for wine himself, he would read books about the great wines of the world so he could make the right purchasing decisions. And that just became a fascination for him, like all the complexities and the subtleties and all the marvelous landscapes around the world where wine is produced. It just became his lifelong passion. So he then went on to study biochemistry at Cambridge, and he met my mum. They were both in the doctoral program in biochemistry at Cambridge. And of course, as part of university life, wine is a big part of that too, the tradition of the high table where the lecturers would be sitting and the doctoral students would be allowed to sit with them. And a lot of these university colleges have great cellars. So his love for wine just deepened and increased. In 1968, I think you could say he was headhunted by the CSIRO to come to Australia and work as a research scientist. And he worked with the Division of Plant Industry, who were based here in Canberra. And so settling here in '68, this lifelong love of wine, he looked at the climate here, he looked at the soil structure that we have around this region, and he said to himself, well, why isn't there a wine industry here? Wow. And to his eternal credit, he had the entrepreneurial gumption to say, well, I'm going to have a crack myself. Wow. So in 1971, he purchased this block here, which was a brand new subdivision of a much larger fine wool growing property, and he proceeded to plant vines. So very small beginnings, real bootstrap operation. Year after year we just built it slowly and slowly, and then now it's become what it is, which is a significant Australian winery.
So Clonakilla, what does the word mean? Clonakilla,
it's actually named after my dad's family farm back in County Clare in Ireland, which is a dairy farm, and it means meadow of the church. Wow. Meadow of the church.
What about you? So why did you get into the family business and winemaking?
Well, that's an interesting story. In many ways, I grew up with it. So we established the vineyard in its initial phase, at least in 1971 when I was 4. So really for all of my life that I can remember, wine has been part of our family culture. It was always there on the dining table at night. Dad would be having a glass or two of wine, and then interestingly to me as a young fella, he would be sipping the wine and then writing notes on it. And I didn't realise that that was an unusual thing. I just assumed everyone, when they had a glass of wine, would write notes on it. So paying attention to wine was part of my environment as I was growing up. I didn't have a taste for it myself until I was probably in my early 20s. In fact, it wasn't until I left home and I moved in with a bunch of other guys into a group house that I realised that wine wasn't necessarily on the dining table every night, and then it wasn't there. I kind of missed it. I missed the culture of it. So I started to do a little bit of wine buying myself, and then it became slowly but surely a fascination for me. But it's important to know, Karl, that in terms of my own education, I don't have any formal qualifications in wine. My training's in theology, actually. Yes, I'm trained particularly in New Testament theology, New Testament exegesis. So I did all the training that a pastor would do, actually.
Yes.
And I was teaching in Melbourne. My wife and I, Lara and I, moved to Melbourne in 1990. That was with our Catholic lay community that I'm a long-standing member of, because we wanted to start a branch of our community in Melbourne. And I got a job as a teacher at a Jesuit school, actually. And I was teaching religious education at Xavier College in Melbourne for 5 years. And as part of being a teacher, you always get some pretty good school holidays, always around that Easter period,
Yep.
just when the wine is being made. So even though I was living in Melbourne, I was able to come up in the school holidays and work with my dad on the winemaking. And I suppose it would be true to say I just fell in love with it. You know, living here, working here, breathing this beautiful, crisp, cool climate, country air. I thought that's where I think I want to end up. So at the end of '96, we left teaching, we left Melbourne. We had the first of our 5 kids with us, Madeline at that stage. She was only 18 months old, and we settled here on the farm in Murrumbateman, and I became the full-time winemaker.
What are the important parts of your faith journey as you grew up?
Well, I was raised, and still very happily am, a practicing Catholic. So faith, again, was always part of my family culture growing up. Though it was an ecumenical family, because Dad's Roman Catholic, but Mum's an Anglican. Mum was an Anglican. So I grew up with an appreciation of the diversity and complexity between, you know, different sort of tribes, I suppose, in the Christian world. I would go to church every day, or every week, I should say. Every Saturday evening, we'd have a Saturday evening service growing up as a kid, and with my dad and my brothers, and it was just part of the environment. Dad would teach us to pray, and one of my strongest memories is my dad kneeling down beside my bed with me at night, you know, with prayers for the evening, prayers for the family. And I also remember strongly when I was in church with Dad, you know, that moment, I'm sure it happens in every church, after we'd have communion, and then after communion, my dad, I had this image of him kneeling down, and he'd still be kneeling there in prayer when the priest would get up to read the notices at the end of the service. So that image of my dad being a man of prayer, I think, is very formative for me. And I found that prayer in my early years came quite naturally to me too. I guess I was in touch, and I do see this as somehow like a grace of God in my life. I was in touch from a fairly early stage with this kind of deeper question that would resonate in my heart about what is this all about? What is this all about? And I remember when I was a kid, in the summer holidays, we have a little place down the coast, and I would love walking up and down the beaches at night. And when I walked up and down the beaches at night, I would be singing to God. And what I used to sing was actually the parts of the Catholic Eucharistic celebration, the Mass, the Holy, Holy, and the Gloria, and the Lamb of God. I mean, these things have been set to music by some of the greatest composers over the centuries, and some beautiful musical settings for these very special prayers. And I think it was an expression of this yearning inside of me to know more of the goodness and the presence and the love of this God who I profess belief in. When I was about 15, I joined a Catholic youth group in Canberra, and there I met some young Catholics who were able to speak about their faith in such a powerful and personal way that when they spoke about Jesus, they did speak about someone they had a personal relationship with. Yeah. And for me, this was another level again. I mean, I was a person of faith, but their intimacy, the intimacy of their language when they spoke about Jesus in particular, was really quite striking and amazing. And I remember saying to some of these young people, well, how did you enter into this experience of relationship, personal relationship? And they said, basically, nothing could be simpler. It's simply a matter of opening your heart and inviting Jesus to come in. Yeah. So I remember going home that night, and then numerous nights after that, I'd be lying on my bed and I'd be praying and I'd be saying, Lord Jesus, you know, I believed in you all my life. I really want to get to know you personally. Come into my heart. And I prayed that prayer every night for, I'd say, 2 or 3 months. And then at the end of that time, I remember going on a Catholic youth camp organised by this same group, this youth ministry in Canberra, where, to cut a very long story short, all I can say is that the Lord answered that prayer with such power and grace that I had an experience of the presence of the risen Jesus, which was so life-changing and so powerful that it basically opened a door in my whole perception of God and the reality of his presence and love that's never been closed since.
Wow.
Yeah.
This might sound a little odd, but as a Catholic growing up, why not the priesthood, given a heart for the kingdom, for Jesus and the church?
That's a good question. It's a good question, and it was asked many times of me when I was a young person, because I was someone who was so full of faith and love for God. Well, are you going to become a priest? But the answer was always no. I didn't feel that was my call, and in the Catholic way of thinking about these things, it is a very specific call to serve as a priest. And there was also some very stringent disciplines attached to it. Obviously, celibacy is the one that's well known. And I never felt that was my call. I always thought I was supposed to be a family man. I had a deep desire to be married and to have kids. And of course, Lara and I married in 1990. We got 5 kids. But the wonderful thing that we've come to understand, particularly since the Second Vatican Council in the 60s in the Church, that serving the Lord and being in ministry is not something which is kind of the prerogative just of the priest, like a small group of professional ministers. It's actually the call of every baptized person. That if you've been baptized, if you're filled with the Spirit of Jesus, then you're called to be an instrument of His presence to everyone and to the world. Whether you're in business, or you're a school teacher like I used to be, or you're in politics, or you are in fact in full-time ministry, the principle's the same. It's expressed in different ways.